Welcome to SpeakUp Talks. I'm Tim Morss, CEO of SpeakUp, and today I'm joined with Andrew McBride. So Andrew is the founder and CEO of Integrity Bridge and a contributor at Compliance Week, and has served in a variety of roles as the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Albemarle, in roles at BP and BHP, has experience in cooperation with the Department of Justice on FCPA action that contributed to a 45% penalty reduction, and has really been outspoken on things like data analytics, continuous risk assessments, and really excited to have you here, Andrew.
Thanks, Tim. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Andrew, you've worked in private practice, big industry roles at BHP, BP, then you were the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer at Albemarle, and then now you've launched Integrity Bridge. So, what's the thread that's connected each of those roles for you? And yeah, just give a little more of a story there.
Yeah, sure. So you've given the Cliff Notes version of the career trajectory. I'll also add that I've had the privilege of living and working in several different countries around the world. And through that, I've had the additional privilege of working in different areas of compliance. So antitrust originally, market manipulation, state secrets, bribery and anti-corruption, sanctions, data privacy, and then more recently human rights. And they're all quite different for sure, but the core elements of a compliance program are the same. But there is more that unites each of those areas of compliance that divides. And I think that to me, that's the thread. And so every time you get up to speed with a new area of compliance, you're learning that area of compliance, but it also gives you greater depth and more confidence to become that holistic risk, ethics, and compliance professional. Now, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that what my career kind of happened by design, but the one thing that I tried to do was remain open to opportunity. So to step out of my comfort zone, to move to a different country, to open myself up to new areas of compliance. And that's certainly something that I would encourage more junior compliance professionals to think about.
Appreciate the background. So, one thing I'm curious about, when you were, you took a job, there was an active FCPA matter, like kind of walk me through, what you learned in building a program during that, and what's something that you wish every first time CCO would know before that fire kind of starts.
Yeah, so to put it into context, I started at Albemarle on a Monday, and on the Friday was our very first meeting with the DOJ and the SEC. So the company had already decided to make the decision to self-report. Fortunately, they told me before I formally accepted the role, so I knew what I was letting myself in for. So for sure, there was fire, and there was probably a lot of smoke at that time. But I guess the advice is that you still need to breathe. And so the temptation, and yes, the pressure that I felt was, to do something. We're under an FCPA investigation. We need to do something, a new policy, new training, new something. But I felt that I needed to listen first. When you join a company, you really need to understand how it works, its strategy, its business plan, its values, just the way it ticks. And so, fortunately for me, the same month that I joined, the company also launched its core values. And so I used that as an opportunity to go around the world, meeting different people, spending time in different business units, different locations, and just listening. And what that meant was that when we did come to start making changes to our governance, to our program, that the changes were right-sized, that we were making changes that were appropriate to the risk of the company, but also to the way in which the company worked. What I would say, so in fact, it was about a year after I joined that we made our first change, and that was to an updated anti-corruption policy. And then, as you might expect, after that, everything started to move very, very quickly, from new technology platforms, a new code of conduct, and everything else. But when you're in that kind of that fire situation, it's really important to breathe and just take a step back and think.
I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, it sounds not too dissimilar to jumping into roles anywhere. And I think that approach is widely applicable beyond just the compliance office.
Sure.
And to kind of stepping into anything when you're gonna learn a lot.
Yeah.
So now you're the CCO. Now you're advising companies. So
Yeah.
I'd be curious. You're getting a wider slice of things now, seeing a lot of different companies and how they operate. And I'd be curious if there's one or a few beliefs you had, from sitting as a CCO that have
Yeah.
changed now that you've moved into this advisory capacity.
Yeah, so that's fine because I go back to a bit of kind of career history here. So started out as an antitrust lawyer, and that's the role that I did at BP and then at BHP, and then more later on at my time at BHP, I took on a broader role in ethics and compliance, and ultimately leading to becoming the chief compliance officer for a period, and making that journey from antitrust into that broader ethics compliance when with antitrust, your outside vendor pretty much was an outside counsel, and that was it. And then moving into other areas like anti-corruption, you had forensic, you had due diligence, you had speaker, you had consultants. And it was kind of overwhelming at first that there was this kind of whole world or universe of vendors out there. And I think that the expression at the time was kind of like FCPA Inc. It was this whole industry. And I have to say that having kind of started out with kind of like, oh my goodness, there's just so many kind of like these vendors out there. What are they all doing? To now, ironically, I am one of those vendors, and I think it's about really understanding that shared collective purpose. We're all trying to pursue an improved ethics and compliance program, making it more efficient, effective by using innovation. We and more broadly to help make companies, a better, healthier, and safer place to live. And so I think that that's probably the journey that I've been on about just understanding the totality of resources that are needed to help build an ethics and compliance program.
Yeah. So to piggyback on that, you know, again, kind of thinking of the shift from in-house to advisory, I'd be
Yeah,
curious of, what are some of the things that have surprised you? I think that could come through multiple perspectives. Some of, clients and maturity and where people are at to look, you now get a broad slice at different vendors. There's running your business. So I'd be curious of,
yeah,
what are some of the things that have surprised you as you've made the shift?
yeah. It's a great question. It really prompted me to take a step back, and I think it's this. So when you're a CCO, and you're in kind of your own company bubble, yes, you kind of like meeting peers at conferences, and but really your intelligence about what other companies are doing comes from perhaps benchmarking reports. And I think through that you acquire this assumption that big multinational companies all have broadly similar ethics and compliance programs. And now, as a consultant, and I'm speaking to a lot more companies, both prospective and current, what I'm really surprised at is the wide variation in maturity and approach. Like it's very significant. And so perhaps you might have bigger competitors in your respective market, but don't just assume that their ethics and compliance program is more sophisticated than yours. There are a whole number of drivers as to what the composition and the resourcing of an ethics compliance be, not least whether the company has gone through a big investigation. That's probably one of the most biggest influences. But it's something that has really struck me. And I think a related point, and perhaps a contributor to this, is the extent to which chief compliance officers' hands are sometimes tied by the maturity of the company's broader enterprise IT systems. And the best example of that was my very first client came in. I was asked to do a review or to help them select new third-party risk management technology. But one of their biggest challenges was that their company had over 150 different ERP systems. So just getting the data from those in order to do the screening and the due diligence was a huge challenge in itself. And I think a lot of CCOs are really struggle with that kind of ceiling, that technology ceiling that they can't break through.
Yeah, having sat on that side the whole time, I echo those, those feelings of that last point in particular of the fragmented IT, enterprise, whether it's HRIS, ERP,
Yes.
all these needs for integrations, and then it comes to actually executing, and it's a lot more complicated than initially let on. And
Yeah.
I think that's one thing that definitely holds a lot of the larger programs back for sure.
Yeah.
Totally agree, especially as you get into monitoring and other things. It's the data
Yes.
in out problem. So,
Yeah.
so to kind of keep going and maybe pivot a bit into thinking about speak up programs and culture there. You and I have talked quite a bit, and one of the things that I know you've said is that the reporting mechanisms are only as good as the trust the employees have in them, right? So, and I agree. I 100% agree with a tool is a tool, and it's just such a small part of the overarching program. I I think this is something a lot of companies struggle with, and I'd be curious for your perspective on what are the most effective ways you've seen people build that trust
Yeah.
in a speaker program, build awareness, all of the things that come to actually making it alive and making it functional.
Yeah, so I'll start with the broadest concept, and that is actually taking speak up beyond the act of speaking up to raise a code of conduct concern. Speak up has much broader connotations. So, in a parallel sense, certainly come from a mining and natural resources background, speak up in the context of health and safety. So, calling out dangerous situations for employees or things that can adversely affect the health of employees, hugely important. And so I've spent a lot of time with my counterpart in health and safety and environment aligning on our messages around speak up. But it goes in broader to that. I think it was the former CEO of BP, Bob Dudley, who kind of used the expression the quietest voice in the room, making sure that those people who are in the room do have a voice, because sometimes that quietest voice may have the most impact with what they have to say. So just encouraging people that active participation in daily work, I found to be enormously effective. Second, I think transparency and communication of your investigation process. What happens when a report is received? Your typical timings for conducting investigations, and then outputs. So communicating the outputs in a way that respects confidentiality and data privacy rules, but still communicating outputs of investigations to show that when someone does report, something is done about it. Third, I would say is leadership humility, and I'll give you a real life example of that. In my career, I investigated one senior leader. It associated with a conflict of interest around the hiring of a particular person. Now, ultimately, the investigation was unsubstantiated, but what I'll say is that the leader was a little bit naive about the way in which this person was hired, and also what this person was saying about the influence or purported influence of the leader over the hiring decision. When the leader found out, the background, he was absolutely mortified to the point where during a town hall, he raised his hand up and said, "Mea culpa, I missed something here. I should have been better." And for me, I found that to be enormously impactful with his team. Is that people do make mistakes, and it's to his credit that he came forward and admitted that he did not hold himself up to the standard that he held himself to, and I think that really did have a positive impact on the workplace culture within that particular company. Now, I'll also call out a warning because sometimes I think that there is a trigger tendency to use risk as a reason for communication, but it could have unintended consequences. And I've got two examples. One, have courage to speak up. We think, have courage, speak up. Well, the employee hearing that goes, well, why do I need courage to speak up? Is there something for me to be fearful of in order for me to have courage to speak up? Or second, we have a firm commitment to non-retaliation. The employee response is, I wasn't thinking about retaliation, but now you're mentioning it. Do I need to be worried about retaliation? And so just being mindful about unintended consequences of those risk-driven communications.
That's a really good point. I wouldn't even have thought of that. Trying to do the right thing and then it coming across wrong. So yeah, I often always recommend speaking with marketing and comms departments to my customers on branding the program and getting these things right, because I'm not a communications professional, and you miss these things even with the best intentions. So it's a really good
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
So on one of the points you mentioned, on the building trust is, a lot of times, things we hear is like reporters just, I put it in and like nothing happens, right? Or
Yeah.
there's that feeling that nothing happens.
Yes.
So where do you think companies fall short in that closing the loop with reporters, or that perceived notion of that, at least? And what then, how does that then impact the future adoption of the program or willingness to raise issues, or anything along those lines?
Yeah. So we're talking here about the fear of futility, which is
Yeah.
one of the key reasons why employees may not speak up. And I think it goes back to kind of what I was saying earlier, that there's a lack of transparency, or if you're failing to manage expectations on the part of reporters or even witnesses or other stakeholders, then that can have a really detrimental impact on your speak up culture. And so taking that down to a tactical level, if you are not immediately responding to a reporter, if you're not providing periodic updates to a reporter, if there is no end of investigation update, which communicates outcomes to a reporter, but in a way that respects the confidentiality and the rights of the subject of an investigation. If there's no visibility of broader remediation measures, then all of those combined will have an adverse impact on your speak up culture. And so you flip it around and think very carefully about positive communication, trying to thread that balance between transparency and respecting the human rights of all people involved in an investigation. That to me is the key. And obviously, tech platforms like SpeakUp are there to facilitate that engagement through the platform.
Yep. So I want to shift into one of your favorite topics, which is the reporting side. I've sat in a number of sessions where I've asked this question, and how do you measure or demonstrate? I think maybe they're two different things, but I think they're often coincide. The program's working,
Yeah.
and I'll ask another one, like that it's valuable, when it comes to things like securing budget and things like that, right? So how do you move, because there's everything like number of reports, there's all these different metrics that people look at. I find a lot of people get stuck in counting things, but
Yes.
is it really telling you anything? So what's your perspective on how you shift reporting from kind of that it's a bunch of pie charts into something truly valuable? How have you gotten that right?
Yeah. So, I mean, clearly, you need to have some numbers, right, in terms of reports, but and then the traditional benchmarks of how that compares with other companies. It is important, but you also have to set it against broader employee engagement. SpeakUp is one type of employee engagement. There are other ways in which you can look at how employees are proactively engaging with your ethics and compliance program. So the number of questions that are being posed, the response rate with surveys, the number of times employees are engaging with your policies and procedures. And that measurement of the proactive engagement by employees of your program is an indicator of one, general workplace culture, the message getting through, and then secondly, the effectiveness of your program. It is so accessible, perhaps so interesting that people are wanting to engage with your program. You can then supplement that with more subjective metrics around employee willingness to speak up, and then unpacking that as to reasons why they would not speak up. You can do that through surveys, which many companies do. Um, but it's also important when we're talking about the effectiveness of your program, you have to go a bit deeper into the effectiveness of the process. So, a significant amount of my time when talking to the DOJ and the SEC while at Albemarle was about how well were my compliance processes, such as investigations or due diligence, actually performing? Were there bottlenecks? So, how long was it taking to complete an investigation? Were there delays at a particular milestone of an investigation? That kind of those data, that metrics about performance. If there are delays, if there are challenges, if you're not communicating outcomes, if you're not following through on remediation, then that can have that trickle down impact onto your speak up culture. It goes back to that fear of futility. What's the point of reporting if the company is not doing something about it? The more challenging aspect is then assessing the, the effectiveness of your speak up program by reference to its impact on other elements of your program. So, is the operation of your speaker program leading to a general improvement in the compliance culture? Are training rates going up? Are the controls that are being in place at the company from a compliance perspective, are they being complied with? Those crossover metrics, assessing one program element relative to another, are challenging to do, but are hugely insightful as to whether your program is truly effective.
It sounds like a great argument, and I know the compliance officers I work with would love this resource of having an analytics person on staff, right?
Yeah.
Which is always a challenge, but I think you're clearly articulating the business case for people to make the ask for that type of role, because ultimately, no one tool can solve this. It's really combining the data from multiple sources, and
Yeah, I agree, Tim. And I would say that, you know, teams have long had governance specialists, training specialists, investigators. I see the role of a data analyst as being utterly is indispensable to many, many elements of your program.
I wholeheartedly agree. So I'm going to shift gears now into the hot topic of, I don't know, the day, the year, the past couple of years, AI. So, you know, I can speak from my own perspectives. I'm sure you're getting this as well, that it's definitely dominating a lot of the conversations that I'm having with compliance teams. I think there's a lot of looking for answers rather than knowing exactly what they're looking for, although seeing the evolution on that. But how to deploy it, where it can be most effective. How do you do that without, increasing risk, because AI comes with additional risk parameters. So I'd be curious what you're seeing these days, and in particular, how have you seen that evolve in the past 6 months? Everything from what you've seen from the technology side, but also compliance officers' willingness to adopt.
Yeah, so super interesting. I've been doing quite a bit of engagement with compliance teams around the world on this. And so earlier in the year, I was spending a lot of time at conferences and running workshops. And so that culminated in me publishing a white paper under the Integrity Bridge website about generative AI use cases and ethical compliance. And that got a huge amount of positive feedback from people, because it really went into those practical use cases that in-house compliance professionals can use in their day-to-day work. So what am I seeing? So ethics and compliance teams are getting pressure from management to use enterprise AI tools that have been given to the company to make things more efficient and more effective. But the problem is that there's a capability gap, a technology gap, in that all of the resources around the deployment and use of these enterprise AI tools are being given to the more frontline functions like marketing and sales in pursuit of higher profits. Whereas actually, there are now studies out there that suggest that the better use cases for AI are more in the back office, in areas such as compliance and supply chain, and where you can actually achieve real efficiencies. But the resources to actually realize those use cases are not being made available to ethics compliance. And so one of the things that I've been helping companies with is to help the ethics and compliance teams identify what those ethics and compliance use cases are, prioritizing them, and then developing a plan for execution. Now, in some situations, uh, the AI that is needed, particularly where it comes to processing of personal data and the need for compliance with responsible AI laws, means it's better to kind of rely on a vendor. And I think that in the world of SpeakUp, case management, the technology that's offered by SpeakUp and the use of AI, I think that relying on a company that's got the appropriate controls in place is probably a better solution.
Yeah, I think that gets underestimated, the amount of controls that a company does put in place around these. I can speak for our company, but I'm sure all of our competitors working on this. There's the NIST frameworks. There's now ISO 42001. There's a lot of work that goes into these, and just throwing something into Copilot definitely isn't getting there when you look at it through those lenses. And some of these use cases are quite sensitive, as you know.
Yeah.
So on that, whistleblowing, one of the AI use cases I'm particularly passionate about, and we've definitely talked about, is the call center's pretty much been the definition of how reporting, especially if you go back 20 years or so. That was kind of the original way of reporting. Then you had web intake, and all of that has come in, but there's still a pretty heavy call element, especially in North America and Latin America. But it definitely has its challenges. What are your thoughts now that you've maybe had your initial view, you've gotten to test some things out, on using AI in that type of intake, in the call center, and also ensuring trust in the employee that in adoption of those programs, using AI versus a human-based call center.
Yeah, so it's so incredibly interesting. If you'd asked me a year ago about AI-driven intake mechanisms, I would have perhaps said, maybe in the next 3 to 5 years, employees would feel comfortable, but using them. But I would have also said at that time that it's really dependent on the speed of employee adoption of AI generally. And that's what's been so interesting, the level of comfort for individuals to use things like ChatGPT, Copilot in their day-to-day personal lives, and actually oversharing on things around personal and sensitive matters means that we have come a huge distance in just a year, where if now the concept of an employee reporting to an AI-driven voice operator, if that barrier has been overcome, then it opens up this world of them making the most of what AI has to offer, which is, from a speak-up intake perspective, ensuring that your reports are high quality and are consistently brought into the case management platform. And if you think about the experience where an employee is filling a form or speaking to a call center operator who has got a script and they can't really depart from the script, if you've got a AI-driven intake mechanism that can react to what a person is saying with a view to getting as much information from that initial report as possible, I think that that's an absolute game changer, and it reduces the amount of time that the investigation will take. There's perhaps less need to go back to the reporter for clarification before you go through your triage process. It enables you to complete all of your underlying metadata much more quickly, which helps from a reporting point of view. And so I would say I've come a long way in my thinking over the past year about the utilization of AI, not just for employees reporting, but also ensuring that if you've got a HR professional reporting, perhaps as a proxy, that they're also using that tool to make sure that you've got that consistent communication of reports.
Yeah. As you know, we're believers in that here, and I think there's other, multilinguality and other things that come into play as well for the non-English speaking world. So it'll be interesting to see how these things, continue on. Um, I'm with you. It's been fascinating how things have moved in the past even 6 months. I think the thing that caught me is exactly what you said when OpenAI released the GPT-5, the outrage of the 4.0 model being retired and how it was people's therapist and friend, and
Yes.
it was quite shocking. I'm still processing what that means on a broader societal perspective, but
Right.
clearly the comfort level of really speaking with AI has totally changed. Especially when you look at things across generations, the younger generations for sure are
Yeah.
AI native, so to speak. So it's been interesting. So with that lens, you put on your Nostradamus cap, I guess. 12 months ago you were there. We're now looking forward at the next 12 to 24 months. What are you advising people to be thinking about when it comes to AI, so that they don't get left behind ultimately? And
Yeah.
use cases that might seem unfathomable now that might be different later.
Yeah. And so I talk a little bit about this in my article on generative AI use cases. Is that really what the role of AI is there to undertake roles or activity that perhaps compliance professionals have done up until now, and I think that that's going to become even more apparent with now the introduction of agentic AI. So it's kind of like an extension of yourself. And if we think about it in the context of speak up and investigations, I do anticipate seeing agentic AI used to help the conduct of investigations. So, compliance manager needs to have some information from a particular system, and it will ask AI to go off and find that. Maybe it's asked to help with doing some form of e-discovery. I think that where it becomes really interesting and potentially controversial is when you've got the agentic AI going out and starting to interview people from a fact find point of view. Again, I think that we're at the mercy of just how comfortable individuals and employees feel engaging with AI agents in their home life, but then also in the workplace. But if that does happen, then I could see that being another tool, compliance manager's disposal, perhaps for less material cases. And so that's one area. I think another AI use case will be, at the moment we have analytics, we have metrics, we have dashboards that requires compliance managers to go in and interrogate that data in the dashboard to figure out what the trends are. They are effectively trying to create that story themselves from the data. With generative AI, if you design the prompt engineering appropriately, it can actually find those stories for you by going deeper into the data, looking at different data sets, joining the dots between them, and telling you a story that perhaps you would not otherwise have been told. And I think that that's going to be really empowering for compliance managers who are, in a time pressured situation. The next level is moving from the metric to the story to the action. And so again, using agentic AI to help trigger an action remediation when it identifies issues, I think is going to be another potential game changer for ethics and compliance professionals. If you see a low speak up rate or a low engagement with a particular policy, the compliance manager could ask a chat GPT type interface, can you organize training for this particular group of employees or this employees in this location? And the agentic AI talks to the learning management system, sets up a dedicated session, and then tracks it through to completion. I mean, just imagine how much time is being saved in connecting the data to the metrics to the action in a systematic way like that. I think it's going to be huge.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think ultimately the way we interact with systems, interface design, it's just going to radically change. And
Mhm.
I'm fully with you. So it's an exciting future, from my perspective. Maybe scary future, but exciting
Mhm.
future. So last question, to close things out, one of the things we think about at SpeakUp is, I always tell my team, especially my product teams, when we think about compliance and how we build technology, we should improve the quality of life for both the compliance teams, but also, the employees, or really the wider audience they serve. So that could be employees, contractors, whoever that may be. So it's not just managing risk. That's obviously critical, but it is, how do we improve that experience for everybody? From your perspective, what are the one, two things that, leaders can do, today to make their compliance programs more of an enabler of that, culture and, the business, rather than, feeling like a burden?
Yeah. If we take a step back and just think what's going on in the world today, um, real transformational change, whether it be at the geopolitical level, the commercial level, which is linked to the geopolitical with changes in tariff policy, the introduction of AI and the impact that that's going to have on company operations, the retention of employees and company culture. Those are tectonic plates that are shifting around the world and having huge impacts on companies. And so companies are trying to grapple with this change, this constant change. And that goes to the strategy and the long-term strategy planning and your annual operating plans. And ethics and compliance professionals, need to be part of those conversations. How can we, as a profession, enable companies to realize those business objectives in a way that also manages risk in a informed way? And so, um, trying to get onto the committees, new country entry, M&A, supply chain risk management. Yeah, I do think that helping to understand what's going on within the world and within your company from a strategic point of view is absolutely indispensable to becoming an effective risk and compliance professional. And then equally, we are a function who perform services, whether it be the conduct of an investigation, due diligence, provision of training. So, how can we demonstrate that our processes are efficient and are effective? How can we demonstrate the ROI if we're wanting new technology investment? Thinking strategically ourselves in the same way that our fellow functions like procurement and IT do, I think if you taught the language of the business, then that will be well received.
Totally agree. Andrew, it's been a great conversation as always. Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone for listening in, and stay tuned for the next episode of SpeakUp Talks. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.